Okay, welcome to part two of your scope management and your project management training. Again, to welcome everyone back. I hope you are keeping well and hope everything is just going fine after this week's uh, first encounter on our face-to-face time. So we're going to move over to Zoom. We can see that Hangouts is just not working. I have included those invitations to you, and I'll keep doing that repetitively over week to week. Okay, but it is our teething process, and that's fixed and that's organized. And today's went kind of well, which is great to see you guys are doing well. All right. What I want to do is just make sure that what I did notice is that a lot of people have not covered Unit 3 or Unit 4, and it is very important that please, guys, to keep up to date with all of this. I know it's very difficult to get off the couch or to stay on the couch and be able to continue with a couple of studies or work as well. And Yeah, let's just let's get through this as best as we can. And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to try and keep the videos a little bit shorter, maybe try and split them up into a couple more sections so you can digest them a little bit easier. So I am going to talk for a shorter amount of time, post a video up, and then you'll see like a part one, part two, part three, part four, and then hopefully that'll help in terms of your consumption. Okay, I just want to in this particular part, I want to focus just on the back end of the network diagram that I asked you to please have a look at. It is the example that you see in front of you over here. We are going to touch a little bit on MS Project, and we will touch a tiny bit on the actual theory itself. But we're going to do, like I said, a little bit at a time. What I want to do is I'm just gonna throw this up here and just to recap as to what we're trying to do here. We had our work breakdown structure that's defined all the work packages from we had our milestones, and we worked them down into deliverables. We worked from deliverables right down into further sub deliverables, and right down to the I would say the lowest end or lowest end of our tier, which is our work packages. And we want to kind of stop at the work package to be kind of be safe. And also remember that I keep reiterating, detail is where you're going to find that you will say, slowly down the line, you will not be I say extorting money out of scope because you haven't identified a specific process. Every time you do that, you must know it's going to cost you money. So it is, and it's also very realistic to expect that you will not identify everything in the beginning. But a good project manager knows to monitor and control each process and each phase and each activity that is fundamental. Like, for example, re-evaluating our work breakdown structure into our network diagrams, and via our risk management, our cost management, and so on and so forth, is an ongoing thing, and that's how you will determine or define or like guarantee yourself some project success there at the end. Just looking at our example here, which you've gone through, we had activities A to H with certain predecessors that you can imagine came from a work breakdown structure that now has been say, well, it's been lined up and lined up with dependencies. Okay, if we always work from left to right to be able to build our early start, early finish. Again, I am repeating a little bit of what happens happened in that video, but I just want to focus on certain things, bring back a focus to certain things. So where it can get confusing is that just the differences on how we select from left to right and backwards from right to left, working on our late start and our late finish. So if you have a look at our left to right, we are looking at our largest out of two possibilities. Can you see that for example, this case over here, we might have a 12 and we might have a 6 as a early finish, but we would pick the 12, for example, because as the early start for our next our dependent process G, which has its two predecessors, both D and E, looking down at H. H has its predecessors, both G and F. If we look again in the comparison of our early finish, both 16 and 7, remember from left to right is about choosing the bigger number which defines slack then, and choosing that 16 to then calculate our critical path moving from left to right. Going backwards, we would look at our smallest of two or more options where there are dependencies. Again, a repetition of what is in the video, but a focus on how to do that, because you can't, and not everyone is expected to get it right or understand it on first hand. So, for example, again, we look at our dependencies. So our multiple dependencies happen from H. See that, and we would have that right here, sorry, we'll go back from H, and then our multiple dependencies would happen back there from G, D, and then to E. So let's take from a good example. A good example would be let's work backwards. So moving from H, I said to you, you must pick the smallest. So at first, we're going to go to 16. 16 minus 4 gives us 12 to give us our our late start. Okay. If we look here, down here, 16, again, minus 2 gives us 14, which is easy and great. And here we enter a choice or a situation, right? Where I said to you that we got to pick the smallest moving backwards. Okay. So from E to F, because there are a multitude of predecessors, okay, that or successors in this case, right? So both E and F will then define the late finish and then the late start of C. In this case, so I said I do it even for myself, so I can remember from left to right is we're looking for the biggest or the largest duration to be entering into multiple dependencies, and then from right to left, so we're working backwards, working our late start, late finish. We're looking at the smallest duration of dependent tasks. In this case, E and F. We see a 14 and we see an 11, and we pick the 11 to then give us 11 minus 2, which will then fill up to be a 9 in this case. The 9 and the 3 are now sitting as options here. And so we would then move back to a 3, 3, and 0 to make sure that we have the correct, the correct, data here. And again, as the video explained, the critical path is determined by which path in this network diagram has 0 slack time. So we would see immediately that, for example, our slack time, for example, here our slack time would be, there would be a fair amount of slack time there. There's 12 minus 6 and 5 minus 11 gives us a fair amount of slack time over there. But if we look at the critical path, which is from A to B to D to G to H, can you see 0 slack time, 0 slack time, 0 slack time, 0 slack time is given over here. Here we see differentiation. Here we see differentiation. And there we obviously, as we fill out, as I explained now, we see differentiation. Excuse me. I'm losing my words there. Okay. All right. So that is important again. So when we're using software, I'm just going to exit out for a second. When we're using software like our MS Project, which again I will start with today a little bit, is it will define this. It will actually develop this network diagram based on the Gantt chart that we will develop. Okay, using again our work breakdown structure, and the work breakdown structure again then is then ordered as we do move along. If we have a look at our theoretics, okay, uh, a couple of things to note when we are, when we're saying maintaining our project, and combining our activities resources, our activity performance sequences, and so on and so forth to meet our project deadline. There are a couple of things we have to consider. For example, identifying our immediate predecessors for all activities. So, as I mentioned before, what we do is we do take our work breakdown structure, and we start deciding what depends on what. Okay, and why it depends on that. Okay, so again, I'll use the example that I just posted up on, or we used from the network diagram, and I'll use that as an example so you can see dependencies and projects. But let's go to a couple more points before we do that. We want to also determine the personnel and no personnel resources required from all activities. So when we look at defining scope, and we're defining the Gantt chart and defining our network diagrams et al., right? We have to take those resources that are either going to be materials, they're either going to be people, manpower, do you understand? Or they might be, outside budgeted costs, for example, accommodation or whatever it may be that might be coming along with that. On this point is specific to, again, those identifying those type of resources and being able to then match them directly, and then with costs, etc., details and costs. Excuse me. Okay, uh, per process. Okay, identifying all intermediate and final dates that must be met. So this again, excuse me, is very important if we are moving. Again, if we're looking at a schedule moving either backwards or forwards, say we start in, by that I mean a project start date. Excuse me, I'm just going to quickly get some water. Stop coughing. Okay, that is much better. Thank you for that. Okay. So, moving right back on. Okay, so determining, we're talking about dates. So we can either have a project that has a project start date, or it has a project end date, and we can work backwards. And again, within project, I'm going to show you where that is defined, and then obviously again we will be able to determine the length of a project, either we're working forwards or working backwards. All right. So in previous lessons did give a good example. We had a good example, for example, of you that the company producing textbooks and providing material for your clients, which had an end date. If we consider that being a project on its own, it had an end date. There was no kind of like breathing room or around that. It was, for example, a 12th of February or a 31st of January, and whatever we had to do around the project, which was supply textbook material to schools or providers, whatever it may be, right? Would have to then work backwards. So even if we had, for example, only a month to accomplish this, so we would then work backwards according from that date, and then would have to play around with where the tasks in the schedule would coincide, and who would do what, and obviously we'd maybe overload a couple of resources in terms of our personnel, our manpower. Okay, to get that accomplished. All right, let's look at a couple more points. So, identifying all activities or milestones outside the project that might affect your project activities. So that's quite self-explanatory. Again, of what I've already said. Draw your network diagram, and then analyzing your project's network diagram to identify all critical paths, as we have looked at already, and their lengths to identify the slack times of non-critical paths. Okay. So that we have looked at again already. If we do need some clarification on that, please just say, and we'll definitely look at doing then a physical example in class. Okay, just some things to consider, please. Is from now on and forever is we have to we have to look at budget, but budget is affected by three other things, right? So people, equipment, and obviously the time. So if you say, well, how does time affect my budget? Well, if we're paying a certain person a certain amount of money per hour, and we're using them for X amount of time, the time then is obviously effective of our budget directly. And we can have a multitude of examples to be able to fit the understanding of how these relation to one another have an effect on the budget. But again, we're looking at people, and we might start with projects that have people that are in source. Okay, so they're not outsourced; they're within our company. They might be working for a salary already, and so the cost of the project becomes a little bit difficult. It becomes difficult to actually define. In instance like that where salary is given and you have to be part of a project, that the people do not cost the project anything. They cost the company a salary, and the project is not costed by the person, but the person is still written or listed as a resource. Okay, as soon as you start to outsource or start to pay overtime, that is when a person is going to cost you and going to affect your budget. If we're looking at equipment, we're also looking at supplies as well. In terms of equipment, we are not looking at an asset that becomes deprecated. So, like for example, a car. We don't look at equipment like that. We're looking at equipment that might require, so for example, a printing, like a printing press or whatever it is that you guys have. I'm sure I'm using an 1860s term for it, but that requires a lot of dispensables, right? So for it to work, and that will cost obviously a certain amount of money. So we look at equipment, and even maintenance on that equipment. Perhaps maintenance is done every month or every week or bi-weekly. That would obviously cost a certain amount within a project, and we have to look at that. But also equipment in terms of things like paper and pens and whatever it may be that are they are consumables basically. I would like to include that in there. Okay, so with time, when you're looking at project, we might be able to allocate a certain process to a number of people, and because it is effort driven, in other words, if it is effort driven, I could have one process that I put four people on, and it might take me a quarter of the time that it initially did because I had four people at a 100% involvement, or there's a word I'm looking for, I can't remember it, but basically a dedication to it. If on the on the reverse of all of that, we might find that we have four people that can only provide a quarter of their time to a specific process. The process will remain at a specific time. So let's say we had 10 days, and in the earlier, like just pre-mentioned example, I put four people on. It comes down to 2.5 days. If it's effort driven now, well, at 100% on all the alternative, like I say, that only a quarter, they can give a quarter, um, uh, you know, uh, dedication, or to the actual process itself. It still will remain at 10 days because those four people are working at one quarter into that 10-day process slash task. So we do look at all these and look at how they interrelate and affect one another. Okay, so I want to stop there just for a second. I said to you, I don't want to carry on too long for each what's that video. And I want to show you an example of taking that particular this particular network diagram, and then just give us a second. All right, which actually, as I said to you, I promised you, and that is true, man. I don't lie. The network diagram is actually constructed within project. Once you define the Gantt chart, okay, the Gantt chart for that, and defining the Gantt chart is something that we will do together. But here is a little bit of a preview. What I would do is I would start a brand new project. I would definitely first go to something that is mentioned also within your text or your textbook. Um, and I would define my project start date in my project tab under project information, where you can go and then decide when will this project begin. I would then also go and have a look at just to see statistically. Here's my baseline. Here's some obviously durations and costs that are involved, which I've already assigned. But again, I don't want to get ahead of myself. Just remember, go to immediately when you start a brand new project, the first place you want to go to is our project information, and then set our project start or our project end date over there. Just while we're on project, there are certain things that I want to also have a look at. So I would go to my options, and I would start playing around with, with certain parts. Don't get too creative there. Certain parts of my options here. So the date format's very important. How you want to define those. I want to just keep that at the PMs, please, because we want to know exactly what time our tasks begin. And we don't want, for example, a short date. You see there where we don't have a time that is described, okay, but rather have one of those particular long date formats where the time is part of the entire, like I say, display. Okay, we have to immediately go to our defaults, which are our rand currencies, and we definitely want to pick the Gregorian calendar just over there. In terms of our scheduling, we have defaults between our 8 and 5 and 8 hours a day, 40 hours per week, 20 days a month. But that doesn't stop you. Trust me. If you wanna, I mean, if you want to define work days to happen on a Saturday, project will not stop you from that. These are only defaults, and that new tasks are automatically, you see that manually scheduled. That's what we actually want, and we'll keep it at that. Okay. Let me just have a look at some of the other ones that might be important for you to tick off. I think these will be fine. That'll be okay. That's great. And that should be okay. That should be okay fine for now. So just again a little bit of a preview as to what is going on is that we are taking, for example, A, and we had there in our network diagram or WBS, we first described it as, you see that I've actually allocated certain resources, okay, that have affected the time of the duration of it, which actually should have been 3 days, because I have both an IT manager and a personal assistant on here. It affected both. It was effort driven, and halved that time over there. And obviously I put H exactly just as your example, your case study has there. And then what we'll do is we'll start working with the dependencies. Okay, as you can see there, both A had both B and C start at exactly the same time, just so that you know that I'm not lying. That's exactly what happened. Yeah, see A, and then we had B and C start at exactly the same time. And so we start defining our MS project from here moving forward. One other thing that you should be looking at is, let's go back here, is definitely our resource sheet. Okay, so defining our resources and three different types of resources that we get. I've included some examples of each. So let's say I have an IT manager. So we have people, which are considered work. We have then disposables, like so our paper is which we consider material, and then we have a cost, which you will see will not have a predetermined amount there. So as I assign a cost to um, one of my tasks here, so as you can see, the accommodation was assigned. Let's just go here. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to my information so you can see how that works. I would then go to my resources and you would see that I would have picked out accommodation and assigned it a specific cost. So you will see that, and again, I will go into detail with this, just a little bit of an overview, just so that you can see what we're getting ourselves into. And again, if you have Microsoft loaded onto your PC, you will automatically have a project also installed onto your PC. And so you should already be able to, look at some tutorials. I do have a 1 gig upload for you, if that's what you would like, and that would take you through um, some really in-depth and great tutorials moving forward. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna stop the lesson just over there. As I've said, promised it to be short, and then I will do part 3 tomorrow, and we will chat. Please let me know if there are any questions and anything I can help with. But yes, this was basically just a reiteration of the critical path analysis, looking at some MS projects and just looking at a little bit of concepts, a couple of concepts in your theory. Okay.